hit the button. Okay, you guys are gonna get something pop up, give permission to record. And here we go. So thanks everyone for coming to All Brains Belong Vermont's Brain Club. This is our weekly webinar series where we talk about everyday brain stuff that impacts our daily lives as adults, as kids, as families, as all the things. And we are really excited today to be joined by Danielle Kent, who is a specialist in executive functioning and social communication, and is an overall magical human that I'm just so excited for us to learn from today. And we are going to be talking about executive functioning.
Really looking forward to it. I'll start off by sharing. Mel, it says screen sharing is disabled, so I don't know if you want to.
Oh, that's typical.
No, it's Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom is just always got funny things. It's allowing me. It's saying it's okay. So we'll just start off by talking about some of the thoughts before we get going for kind of being here. First of all, thank you for being here and stepping in for this week of the Brain Club. I love talking about executive functions. Just a familiar reminder, all forms of participation are okay and welcomed. I'll invite dialogue at certain points. I'll say, drop in the chat box, or feel free to, raise your hand and unmute. That's how you communicate best. Also, feel free to take in the information, and I'll give my email at the end if you're one who wants to reach out at the end if you have any questions about anything that I shared today. Video is welcome to be on or off, no expectation anytime of eye contact. Walk around, use a fidget, get a snack, whatever works for you and your body and your learning style. And everybody is always welcome. Adults, kids, pets, stuffies, whoever's in your house, welcome them to the club. And then just contact information, just welcoming. If you want to know more, this Brain Club, there are some amazing speakers weekly. Feel free to keep allbrainsbelong.org/community starred in your browser and check it often, because there's some amazing things happening. So with that, I will go ahead and share the slides for today. And like I said, I welcome and love participation, and come as you are and be here as you are. So just an intro to executive functions. That's what tonight's all about. We just have 1 hour, and I do workshops on executive functions for whole days, or in days at a time. So whole days and multiple days. So I thought, how can I deliver this in 1 hour in a way that's not too much information, but just the right level of information? So hopefully I get it tonight. I have to stop late because I often use this analogy with teams talking about prioritizing or giving the green light to prioritizing executive function skills. I think it's really important. These skills, as you'll see, are really important. And I really value how much they play into a student's overall academic and social profile. This quote from Stuart Shanker is just one that I really keep close to me at all times. And it's, when we treat stress behavior as if it were misbehavior, we can make things worse by increasing the child's stress load rather than figuring out what the stresses are and how to reduce them. And I start off with that quote because a lot of the students that I work with have executive function differences, resulting in what often is labeled as misbehaviors or behaviors. When really what I've come to understand through the last 10 years of my clinical experience is it's really stress behaviors gauged by not yet having the full capacity of skills to meet the demands of the situation. And if we look at these quote unquote behaviors as, malicious, willful attempts to misbehave, we miss the whole part of being able to teach crucial skills that our kids are really needing. The same thing also goes for adults. I have the same experience with adults where they begin to define themselves as lazy or defiant or, just a bunch of other characteristics that really tie back to their executive functioning skill sets and how they're differently functioning than those around them. So most importantly, I hope you walk away tonight knowing that understanding how your brain works, understanding your own executive functions, understanding your kids' executive functions can really help you better relate to yourself and how you participate in your day-to-day world, and also better relate to the kids that either are in your home or that you work with. Feel free to drop in the chat box if that's something you feel comfortable with, kind of something you're looking forward to tonight's talk. I'd love to know what you're excited for to be here and what you're hoping to tune into. So a quick overview agenda for tonight, really wanting to talk about executive functioning skills, and then also how they might tie into behaviors, and then some classroom and social considerations. And then a real brief bite, if I could call it like a snack bite, of strategies and immediate implementation. To get to the heart of strategies, we have to understand the framework, the foundation of what executive functions are. But I hope tonight gives you that taste, just a little taste of strategies you can walk away with and moving forward. So the outline, which is my plan, this is my goal, why, plan, do review, which is an executive functioning tool that you can use with some students. And it's just the ability to set a goal, identify what your goal is. That's, spoiler alert, that's the heart of executive functioning. It's being able to make goals and have goal-directed behavior. Make a goal, figure out why it matters, make a plan to meet that goal, do the plan, and then review what worked, what didn't work. So this goal, why, plan, do, review is often just a key strategy and tool that I'll use often with the young students all the way up to the adults that I work with in supporting executive function development. So my goal always is to equip adults and students to understand the link between executive functions and self-regulation and the crucial importance of co-regulation. You're going to hear me weave in co-regulation today. That's one of the foundational parts of what I do and what I talk about, is the importance of co-regulation, or regulating with somebody else. Co-regulation is the foundation for how we develop self-regulation. I'll show you a chart later about just kind of what that looks like, how we transition from co-regulation to the development of self-regulation. Deliver the workshop, and then I always love feedback, and I continually am changing and evolving. So that's the best part about being human that I tell my students is, you're probably never going to be there. We refine our skills, we get really good at things, but there's always an opportunity to learn. There's always a chance for us to get better at things and do better at things. And this is just kind of the graph that I'll use when talking with parents specifically, is what happens in our development of self-regulation. This adult-led, adult-shared, student-led, and then self-regulation. So executive functioning, the piece of the pie we get to enjoy today. So you'll see a couple of slides later that I consider our ability to regulate, or our self-regulation skills, are comprised of our executive function skills, our co-regulation experiences, and our sensory processing skills, and our communication skills. Those four things kind of overlap to how we regulate. We're really focused tonight on executive functioning. But I always like to say dysregulation can be driven by executive function differences, as well as differences in communication, sensory processing, and co-regulation experiences. So if it suits you and your communication style, feel free to drop in how you define executive functions. How have you defined it in the past, or how do you define it now? I'd love to hear, if you're feeling comfortable to drop in the chat box. I'd love to look at that, or have a moment. So I'll just give just a couple seconds here. So if that's your form of communication, you have a second or two to drop it in the chat box. And if not, that's okay too. All the things. All the things. That's how I feel like it is. To do the things. Yes. The things, right? The things. Yeah, so the things, all the things. So in 2016, I went to a talk by George McCloskey, who is one of the big researchers in the field of executive functions. And he pulled up this chart that you see here, and all of a sudden, it's like it clicked. So I had been wondering for years, I was working with students as an SLP, and I'd be doing general speech language things, and it just seemed like I was missing something. These students were having differences, and they would have frequently have late assignments. They would frequently not be able to find their things when they wanted to. They get really frustrated if a problem popped up with a peer. There are all these little tiny pieces, these little threads that I thought, I'm missing something. I'm missing something. And so, alas, when I saw this chart, I said, this makes sense. So the way we talk about executive functions are all the skills that support us to act in a forward-focused, goal-directed way. And some people hear the word goals and go, huh? Goals is just the ability to make forward plans. And really, as humans, we are forward-thinking individuals. We have to always be thinking forward. Everything's always forward moving. We can certainly reflect on and learn from the past, but we're always acting and planning forwards. So these skills range from self-activation, which is getting to the awakened state to engage in activities. This is why a lot of times neurodivergent folks have a hard time with arousal in the morning. These executive functioning skills relate to self-activation, those first things in the morning, all the way up to this trans self-integration, these skills that support us to find our kind of highest human consciousness level. The skills we talk most about on a day-to-day basis is this cluster of self-regulation skills. These are the ones that we most often talk about for day-to-day purposes. So if we're thinking, okay, so these executive function skills are these skills that support us to act in a forward-focused, goal-directed way. And I'll even add in flexible, a forward-focused, flexible, goal-directed way. We think, okay, that's great. What do we know about where they are in the brain? Well, when we look at the inner networking of how the executive function skills, a lot of the capacities are housed in the prefrontal cortex. Those of you who are really into like really nerdy brain stuff, the medial prefrontal cortex is where a lot of them are housed. Also the dorsal prefrontal cortex. But those skills don't act alone. They connect with other parts of the brain. We're constantly shifting. We're constantly sending messages. The hippocampus, for example, which holds memories, the amygdala, which is our fear control. There's a lot of inner networking that happens in the brain, but the management team of skills is housed in this prefrontal cortex. This is why if those who experience a concussion or a brain injury, if you've known somebody, maybe if you have, you might have experienced temporary differences in your executive function skills, your ability to direct yourself and have forward-focused, flexible, goal-directed behavior. The Center for the Developing Child has a lot of phenomenal resources, particularly around executive functions, as well as serve and return, which I don't talk a lot about tonight. But for those of you working with young children or providing supports to young children and their families, the resources for serve and return are simply phenomenal on this website. And serve and return essentially is that importance of when children are young, they're constantly sending us serves through their communication, through their points, through their gestures. And some serves might look different. Some serves might be certain actions that children are sending us messages, and then we return their serve by responding to the serve they're sending us. It's one of the pinnacle parts of how we co-regulate early on and how we attune to each other. I just copied and pasted the link into the chat box. Because this is only an hour talk, I won't play the video that I normally play, but I do encourage you. It's a really great, quick video. And if you ever work with families or you know somebody who's curious about executive functions, this website and the videos, and maybe I'll just quickly show you. It also has a section for activities, which I really enjoy, and then printable handouts. So let me just share that quick. So the video is right there up top. Watch the overview video. And you'll see on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of resources, particularly under step 3, building executive function skills. There's an activities guide. And in there, if you scroll down, it has activities for all age ranges. These are all skills or activities that you can practice to really support the development of executive function skills. You'll notice most of them are play-based, which is how we best learn executive function skills when we're young. So sometimes I get a flip of executive function dialogue. People will say, okay, so forward focused, flexible, goal directed behaviors, that sounds really important for academics, but I don't understand how this affects social skills. Or I'll get the inverse. People will say, well, it makes sense how it affects socially, but I don't understand how it affects academics. And the important thing to know about executive function skills are that they affect both. They affect us academically, and they also can affect us socially. So this is why I'm a huge proponent for executive function supports earlier than high school, because executive function differences can show up in play for younger learners. And this is the book by Paul Tough, How Children Succeed. And it said, in those skills, executive functions are especially valuable in school. We're constantly asking kids to deal with contradictory information. The letter C is pronounced like K unless it's pronounced like an S, which drives me nuts. Tail and tail sound the same, but have different meanings. A 0 means one thing on its own, an entirely different thing with a 1 in front of it. Keeping track of those various tricks and exceptions requires a certain amount of cognitive impulse control, and that is a skill that is neurologically related to emotional impulse control, your ability to refrain from punching the kid who just grabbed your favorite toy car. So these skills, these cluster of skills that support us as humans to act in a forward-focused, flexible, goal-directed way have an impact on us academically and socially. I don't touch a whole lot on this tonight, but specifically academically, executive function skills can show up as splinter deficits in several areas, specifically in phonological processing. A lot of students who sometimes are later caught for reading difficulties had early difficulties with phonological processing, their speech development, language processing, mathematical computation and concepts, and visual imagery processing for symbols. All 5 of these can be impacted by executive function differences. And these 5 are core to the academic demands, especially earlier on as students are learning how to read. That K-3 timeframe, when we're learning how to read, and then in 3rd to 4th grade, we shift reading to learn. There's a huge demand on all 5 of these areas. Oh, yes. Those are for high schoolers, right? So that's, I think, almost every conversation I have with somebody who is maybe becoming more invested in executive function skills. They'll say, oh, yes, those are for high school. Yeah, high schoolers. We should really talk about that in high school. And I say, we've got to back it up. We got to back it up, and we got to start talking about these skills early, even starting in pre-K, especially as the brain is really networking and rapidly developing associations. The reason is, I can't tell you how many middle schoolers and high schoolers develop beliefs about themselves because of their executive function differences. And this is a good time for me to say, I use the word differences, especially when I'm talking with young kids. That is not to make any less important or any less valid the difficulties experienced by people who have executive function differences. So I do say, I use the language of differences, and you'll see throughout the presentation I have it starred. I want to say I use that as language when I'm talking to all kids, so that we celebrate these differences and we understand that we have different brains, but that's not to discredit the difficulties that people may experience because of those differences. So do know that. So looping back, I can't tell you how many middle schoolers and high schoolers, because of their executive function skills, their differences, they've developed beliefs about themselves, really negative, limiting beliefs about themselves, because for so long, the message they got was that they didn't fit into the mold. They didn't meet a certain standard. They weren't successful. They couldn't pay attention. I just had a 4th grader last month. You know, Miss Danielle, I just can't pay attention. Those beliefs about themselves. So this is why getting in earlier and talking about executive function skills, developing strategies, developing brain awareness. What do you know about your brain? How can you be successful? What does success mean to you? But the earlier we can get in, the more we can avoid this reticular activating system, which is a part of our brain that once it gets a message, it starts to pick up more information from the environment that supports that message. So if I said, when's the last time you saw a yellow Ferrari, you'd be like, probably never, because it's Vermont. But next time you see one, you're going to go, yellow Ferrari, because I told you to look for it. Same thing happens for our kids. If they get that message that they're not as good, they're not as successful, they're going to keep looking for that information in their environment, and those beliefs solidify. So by the time it's middle and high school, it's not too late, but we have to undo a lot of the perceptions that kids develop. If we do this early, we can make a big, big difference. So looping back, just talking about this, what exactly is executive functions? The many complex skills that support us as humans to act in a forward-focused, flexible, goal-directed way. And Mel, yeah, broken, defective, and inadequate. Yeah, if we aren't talking about it, and I think especially adults later diagnosed in life, kids feel it, but adults later diagnosed, not really knowing how their brain works and thinking that it's faulty compared to those around them. All that time that people struggle and don't have the supports to really develop skills and get to know their brains. And then just remembering with executive functions, it starts with nonverbal working memory. So the ability for us to think forward starts with nonverbal working memory. So if I were to pose the question, what are you going to do when we end this talk tonight? You'd start to think forward. You'd start to think forward about it. And as Sarah Ward and Kristen Jacobson always talk about, you'd start to picture the future, that ideation. You'd start to picture the space, the time, the objects, the people. You think forward, you say, well, after this, I'm going to, you start to picture it, and then you put language to it. But EF starts with nonverbal working memory. That's why trying to picture the future is such a crucial skill, that ideation skill. So thinking specifically about the skills, like I said, those skills range from self-activation all the way up to trans self-generation, arousal, all the way up to our highest form of consciousness. We're really focusing on this cluster of skills that we see on a day-to-day basis. So it's 33 clusters. We don't have time for that tonight. So we are just going to focus on these skills: planning and prioritization, organization, time management, response inhibition, emotional control, sustained attention, flexibility, and metacognition. These are the ones that I see most often pop up in school. And these are the ones that I see pop up most often as they relate to dysregulation. So planning and prioritization. If I were to say which EF skill to walk away with and really start thinking about and looking at, this is the top one. The ability to make a plan and the ability to prioritize what you need to do is foundational to have. All these skills are foundational, but this plays into play and academics so richly that everything kind of ties around it. So we're really being able to create a map to reach a goal or task. So I'll often define executive functioning skills as the GPS of the brain. How do I make the plan to get where I need to go? How do I map it out? So students, and you'll see this is where I put the differences with the asterisks. So if students have differences with the planning and prioritization skills, they might have differences with following routines and sequences, organizing and keeping track of steps of a task. They might have difficulty even generating steps of a task, forward thinking and planning for events, play plans and directing self, knowing how and where to get started, and closing loops and opening loops. And closing loops is like completing mini goals throughout the day. And we make mini goals throughout our whole day. We close loops and then we open new loops. So I got to get ready for work on time. I close that loop. I get in the car on time. I close that loop. It's just opening and closing loops all day long. But sometimes that transition from closing a loop to opening a new loop can be a challenge because we have to continue ideating and thinking forward. This is why video self-modeling and video self-prompting have become really huge in the research sector around executive function supports. And I'm not a big, the word prompting put me off initially, but as I've read more about it, video self-prompting is gaining some traction. And I'm continuing to keep an eye on how it's being used as a strategy really for independence and really making sure it's neurodiversity affirming. That's important to me. There's been some really great research around young adults using it for reading purposes and for ADL meaningful ADL task completion for them. Organization. For organization, what I always say to students is it's just that you are able to create and maintain systems for keeping track of things. And so that's the big key here is, do your systems work for you to keep track of the things you need them to? So if we're struggling with organization, we might have differences with keeping track of personal items. The backpack and desk might be messy. Messy, keyword, messy means we don't know where to look for things and we don't know where to find them. We don't know where to put them. So there's no system. That's what messy means to me, because messy, the term messy is pretty subjective. And I've worked with some students who outwardly things appear pretty messy, but they know where things are. And so I say, your system has to make sense to you. That's the important thing. And being able to describe it's important too, but it has to make sense to you. My husband has like 3 places he puts his keys. It makes 0 sense to me and it would drive me bonkers, but it's his system and it works for him, but it would drive me bonkers, but it's his system and he knows what to do. So when he loses his keys, he knows where to look. So that's the key. Putting, for younger and older examples, putting toys away and then keeping track of homework assignments. You'll notice I try to weave in examples for older and younger students, and also trying to weave in examples for adults too, because differences can show up in a range of ways. So big thing about time management is understanding that time is a continual construct, knowing where you are in time, what is past, what is coming, and how to use time to your advantage. This is really important. This is really important. We focus a lot on elapsing time strategies with kids, timers. And I will say for preschool and younger, those work really well, because for preschool 3 to 5, their ability to think forward is 0. Their ability to think forward is 0. They've done a research on it. 3 to 5, their ability to think forward is in the now. That's the time that exists for them. That's why when people use forward consequences for preschoolers, I'm like, they can't think that far forward. That's not fair. Their brain only knows time as it is right now. And only as we get older and older do we buy ourselves more time. But even at the oldest that they've done research on, like 18, 21, which is college age, it's still, I think, a week or 2. I'll try and confirm if anybody wants the exact numbers. I can get you the numbers, but our ability to think forward when we're younger is very limited. We develop it. It's a skill across time. It's a skill of knowing how to use time from the most finite time, minutes, to the more extended time, weeks, months, years. So if for time management, if we have differences, we might see differences with completing daily tasks with minimal distractions, speeding up as needed to finish tasks. This one will often come up as a big flag for me. If I just hear it in the hallway, I'll hear, it seems like whenever we tell them to speed up, it's really dysregulating for them. I'll say, I'm not even invited to the task, but I'll be like, have you thought about executive function skills? So that's a big one. That's a big one. Finishing a task with a constraint. So, okay, I need you to finish that circle, finish that letter, and then you can go to circle. Completing morning routines with a time constraint. This one also ties into planning. And then adjusting times as needed as students get older. Time management becomes more and more important as students get older. Response inhibition, think before you act. So this is Stopatron. It used to be this cluster of characters called EFs to the rescue. They shut down during the pandemic. I actually haven't checked to see if they were back up and running, and I should do that because I've been curious. They weren't last time I checked, but I would love that. And sorry, the chat, I had your videos over the chat. I haven't seen it work on this earlier with kids. How early should it be when we notice the signs? Amy, I start to talk about our brains in preschool. When we're existing when we're starting to get that 3 to 5 time range and we're interacting with peers and things become more structured, I'm talking about it 3 and up. I will say the differences in the pandemic, the global stress and all that we've experienced collectively has made a huge difference in executive function skills. So it's my prediction we're going to see significantly different executive function skills especially in this cluster of kids that's coming up and hitting kindergarten and first grade and second grade, because their normal school, they haven't had normal schooling. They've never had a full normal school experience where you learn a lot of these skills just by the existence of being in school. Yeah, can we talk about the dopamine related novelty part where the organizational systems predictably need to change? Absolutely. Do you want me to mention it, Mel, or did you want to ask a more specific question? What?
Go for it. No, because I think that people do know that we need organizational systems, and we do teach the kids this, but then the kids still feel broken because the system doesn't work. But that's actually like a thing.
Novelty.
It's completely predictable that your system only works for a short period of time, because part of the reason that it is organizing is because it is novel.
Yeah.
For some brains.
For some brains, absolutely. And that's why knowing your brain is really important. And that's why trying different things out. So if something works for a little bit and then doesn't, then we can ask the question of, okay, well, what needs to happen now? Let's try something different. And the key part, though, is looping back to knowing your brain, recognizing, oh, it's not working for me. It's we got to try something new now. Because so that's part of that's developing that introspection, that metacognition, that ability to tune in and be like, this isn't working anymore. And that's a skill in of itself. So yes, absolutely. I've moved videos. I've never had that happen before. The chat wasn't normally like blops out at me. So differences in response inhibition, differences in maintaining regulation in play, following classroom rules, and handling conflicts without getting into physical fights and calming down with support. These are the ones that we might see some differences in. Interruptions, yeah. And part of the interruptions too is sometimes difficulties, I don't talk about working memory tonight, but working memory is involved too. So interrupting sometimes is because I'm worried I'm going to forget the thing, because I do forget the thing if I don't say it. So that's another part of it. So yes, response inhibition and working memory. Yeah, Mel.
If I could, is it okay if I add this, because I think this is important. I think that kids get a lot of flack for interrupting because of this response inhibition thing. So as an adult with executive functioning differences, I can say that at all times, I have an active response inhibition loop going all day, because I'm having like 50 ideas at a time and no working memory, and they will be gone if I don't say the thing. And because of the reticular activating system with attention and alertness, when I'm listening to something that's auditorily complicated, like someone talking for a long time, in order to stay with that, I have to be almost like feed forwarding it. Like I have to be anticipating the next thing, kind of like when we're like active readers and we're kind of predicting what's going to happen in the story or the movie. I'm doing that in a conversation. And so if I'm doing that to stay awake and alert and with you, but I'm also like responsive, I'm going to interrupt you every 5 seconds, right? So that's like part of my brain. And so I try to talk about this with families, because it's like, kids, like everybody gets shamed for interrupting because it's like, rude to interrupt, but it's such a complex EF skill.
I think it's always interesting how to ask, like the rude to interrupt. I've always been curious about some things, the neurotypical expectations of some things, like why is that? Is it because I don't know, like I actually don't know, like some of these expectations and these things that are kind of unspoken. Yeah, brain roll it, because it does. I think it's good for us to practice being able to like recognize when there's danger and stop, right? That inhibition. So I think there's that need for inhibition. But when it comes to social, that's interesting. And I think breaking it down, yeah, Hannah B, that's this conversation in my family. Yeah, I do think it can be triggering sometimes for the adults, because then you kind of lose your thoughts. And so that can be kind of triggering. So it's good to have norms, family norms, and be talking about like, what are our family norms, and also practicing that there is kind of this unspoken social dynamic about interrupting somebody when they're in the middle of something. But as you, like in your family, in your social networks, kind of opening up dialogue for how communication will go can be really helpful when it comes to this area. Everyone communicates differently. I I'm not going to talk a lot about emotional regulation and control, because this one is like its own huge topic. Dysregulation often is like but what causes dysregulation are a lot of the other things. But recovering from difficulties or differences in emotional regulation and control, you might show up with difficulties or differences in recovering from disappointment and changes of a plan, modulating emotions or physiological states from one condition to the next, ability to handle losing in games, accepting others winning, going with other ideas in social groups. But the real thing about emotional regulation and control is there's something else happening for them. There's something else happening for them. I always go back to Ross Green's statement, kids do well if they can. We do well if we can. And whenever adults want to kind of hammer on the behavior part of things, I'll try and track back to like, when was the last time you got really frustrated or really mad or really angry? And was it malicious or willful, or was there something going on for you? And as humans, like, this is why knowing your brain, knowing your triggers is really important. But we are often always doing the best we can. And so recognizing dysregulation as an identification that something is happening. I have a need, something's happening for me and I have a need that's not met. If you're familiar with NVC, nonviolent communication, that's what NVC is all about. But really, really important. Sustained attention. This one's a biggie, especially, being able to sustain, attention to the task despite boredom and fatigue. And I guess what I always say to students here is this one, this one is often really about giving the perception that you're maintaining attention, because all of us cognitively break away and come back during long tasks. That I have yet to know, unless, regular meditators and mindfulness folks, they are able to kind of stretch their attention for longer and longer periods. But even, those who meditate and are very good at it will describe only minutes at a time being able to kind of attune to their own thoughts. So for those of us mere mortals, right, being able to sustain attention requires breaking away and coming back. And breaking away and coming back is a great thing. So completing short chores, sitting through circle time, spending 20-30 minutes on homework tasks, completing chores, and attending and focusing on sports practices and favorite activities. Key one here is favorite activities. So I always focus on this with the students I work with, on things that are important to them. So if they would like to develop the skill to sustain attention for something longer, then we'll talk about strategies and ways to do that. That's the key part there. Dopamine is the magic. Flexibility. This one's a big one. It comes up pretty often where people will say like, they're just not flexible and they need to work on flexibility. Flexibility is the ability to change your plan as needed. But oftentimes flexibility is, I have a hard time with the opposite of it being rigidity. And the way I describe it to people is, if our brain, if EFs are like a GPS and we map out that it's going to go a certain way, and all of a sudden the GPS says you can't go that way, and my brain doesn't yet reroute quickly, that's really dysregulating. So some brains, when the GPS says, oh, we got to reroute, we can't go to the movies tonight because the movie theater's closed, or we can't have cheese pizzas today because the oven broke, or whatever it is, some brains can go, okay, let's reroute the map. We still need to eat, so we can have peanut butter and jelly. Some brains, that rerouting can be really triggering, can lead to like that downstairs brain reaction for a multitude of reasons, either difficulty making a new map, perception of threat, the demand component. So I think it's important that the narrative shifts a little around flexibility, and that we get to understand that it's, differences in kind of changing plans. So differences with adjusting to changes in routines and schedules, tolerating redirection, stuck on disappointments, and being able to shift gears. And I use that word stuck pretty loosely there. I think of it literally as that brain gets kind of stuck in a certain area and it has trouble shifting, like actual car shifting, and then completing more open-ended tasks that have less specificity. And then lastly, metacognition, thinking about your thinking, reflecting on your own abilities. This is why tuning into yourself, your skills, what you're noticing, And I think I'm going to focus a lot on a strategy I call noir, which is notice, objectify, identify, and reflect. Reflecting on what's working for you and what's not working for you is really, really important. So metacognition differences might show up as differences in making adjustments to play when something isn't working, supporting peers to complete a play plan. Although I always say, don't wholly rely on this because we have a lot of work to do to support all kids, to support each other's play plans. So if it's not a neurotypical play plan, some kids don't know how to support it, but I digress a little bit. Watching others and adjusting behavior, generating several solutions to problems. And then I get a lot of metacognitive information from watching students play video games or engage in video games. How they problem solve and troubleshoot. I get a ton of information in video games. So these skills work together. They're really difficult to tease apart. I broke them out so we could talk about them and talk about how they might show up, how they, and I think for those who are really well-versed in executive functions, that was nothing new. But a lot of times executive function skills are new to people. Even if they've heard of them loosely, they think of them as academic skills. And so when we go through those individual skills, parents, teachers, other adults start to go, oh, that could be what's happening for my child, student, uncle, aunt, whoever it is. So going through them and breaking them down and thinking about them, that they're, clusters of skills, but they weave together. Like think about planning. To make a plan, I have to also have a sense of time management. I have to be able to organize my materials, and they all kind of tie together. Thanks for coming, Amy. So 6 key factors of executive function. Students must develop the capacity to use situational awareness and intention awareness to imagine a hypothetical future. That's the key part about executive functions. We're imagining a hypothetical future. Nonverbal working memory must predate self-speech. So developing that ability to kind of picture it, then talk about it is the key factor of how executive function develops. If then, I always tell parents to start weaving in if then conditions as tolerated. So if we have dinner first, then we can do this. That if then reasoning helps create space between here and now and the future. And what we're always trying to do is tie in actions now, play into the future. Actions now, play into the future. Students develop the ability to sense and see how time passes. Yeah, if then is different from first then. Yes. First then, I'm never saying like, let's leave your special interests for later and let's do something else now. I'm always saying if then, that hypothetical reasoning for executive function purpose. So it's that ability to say, okay, if I don't do, like I'm going to use an older student example, if I don't do that now, then what happens? It's that ability. Yeah, so Elizabeth, who don't see pictures in their mind, what I'll do is I will, if it's, depending on my relationship with a student, I will try to draw out a loose picture to start developing that concept. Like, okay, let's see, here's how I picture it. Let's say we're going to a new place. Here's how I picture it. If we can look up pictures, I'll also look up pictures of it with them. But then when I'm there with them, I'll also take pictures of it and we'll kind of compare and contrast. How did we picture it and how did it turn out? So I'm kind of looping that skill of how that happens. And then gradually, I'm going to take most of the responsibility to start for that. I'm going to draw the picture. I'm going to take the pictures and show them. And then gradually, I'm going to try and release that responsibility. If we can externalize the drawing, if we can externalize it in any way, then we can try to start to internalize it and picture it. And a lot of this, there's some great information coming about like really tuning in to yourself and your body, tuning into being able to look at a picture and close your eyes and picture it. Lots of thoughts, Elizabeth, lots of thoughts. But I'll usually start by drawing it and then, or looking at a picture. And then when I'm there, I'll take pictures and then we'll compare and contrast. And then we're kind of looking at it before and after kind of how do we picture it and then the afterwards. Yeah, that ideation component, which is why externalizing it can be so helpful. These are just some questions because sometimes executive function comes up and people say, well, I don't know if this is really executive function differences or difficulties. And I'll say, well, these are some questions that I think are really important to ask. And they can get us to really think about, our executive function differences playing into their profile? Can they recognize and determine necessary or desired goals? Can they generate relevant, strategic, and efficient plans? Can they initiate those plans and persist with efforts? Can they monitor efforts in order to notice and fix errors in execution? And can they do this around things that are meaningful to them? That's what's really important to me. If they are really into Pokemon, can they engage in tasks around Pokemon that are meaningful to them? So the key here is not, can they do it around math class, which may not be as engaging for them, but can they do it around tasks that are really meaningful for them? That's where I start. I start with what's already giving them joy, what's already giving them dopamine, what are they already engaged with, and then wrap around with that. So I think I'm just noticing time. So I'm going to skip. Maybe I'll come back to this as a final checkout, but this is a big one. So I normally have the crowd do this, but I want you to just see, these are all, I'm really big about reframing behaviors. I'm really, really big about that. Really big about that. Don't think I could say it more, but reframing what we see as external behaviors and what could be happening. And oftentimes a lot of the behaviors that we see might be stemming from EF differences. So talking without raising hands, differences in response inhibition, also interrupting response inhibition differences, frequent what's called tantrums past the young age, differences in emotional control, differences in physiological awareness, differences in interoception. That's where sensory processing comes in. But those all play out to executive function differences. And you'll see here, this is the 4 bubbles that I talked about. Self-regulation is a combination of executive function skills, co-regulation experiences, sensory regulation, and communication skills. And that's why when a student is experiencing dysregulation, I like to look at all 4 of these. What's happening for the student in all 4 of these areas, and how can we support them? How can we support them? I'm pretty sure there's, Mel talks about co-regulation. Hannah B, I know you talk about co-regulation. Teaching and coaching self-regulation skills, teaching and coaching executive function skills is one of the key components of co-regulation. Co-regulation is responsive and proactive. Responsive when our students have left their optimal regulation zone, or when our children have left their optimal regulation zone, to support them to return back to their optimal regulation zone. And proactive is when we can kind of teach and coach those self-regulation skills. I don't know, has anybody read The Body Keeps the Score here? I'm just rereading it, but feel free to drop in the chat box if you've read The Body Keeps the Score, because it's really reminded me, the second read, about the importance of these 4 S's as we're kind of teaching and coaching these self-regulation executive function skills. Safe to learn, secure to take risks, seen for their strength, and a place to work, and soothing. A lot of our students need to work on all 4 of these. All 4 of these components. A lot of our kids need to work on these 4, and us as adults often need to work on these 4, especially in our journey. And that co-regulation leads to the development of self-regulation. So where teams will often want to start with me is here. They'll say, well, I love this idea of executive function. How are we going to get them to regulate themselves? How are we going to get that to happen? And I'll say, what I encourage we talk about is how we're going to develop this graph for co-regulation, which is this graph. This is the typical trajectory of co-regulation from infancy through adulthood. This is the level of caregiver leading the co-regulation. You'll notice the graph is kind of trending upwards. How are we going to write plans? How are we going to support the student through co-regulation so that they have somebody to responsively co-regulate with them when they've left their optimal regulation zone, and proactively teach, coach, and model those skills to support independence and interdependence, right? I think that's the keywords that are missed are interdependence. We talk about kids being independent, but as human beings, we're really wired to be interdependent and hold on to each other, and so rely on each other to support us through the process. co-regulation is hard when the adult is dysregulated and doesn't know. Yeah. So I talk about responding to dysregulation as the COAST method. So check in with yourself. Are you calm? Observe and acknowledge, support, and then teach. Teach is the last part. Teach the skills that need support. But our ability to co-regulate can often come from a place of understanding dysregulation, and then at the heart of dysregulation, what it is, and also understanding and acknowledging the triggers, the trauma that we may have experienced and that we may be experiencing in response to dysregulation. Our brains are really great, and the really early developed parts, the amphibian brain, is the most. It's the part that's fully formed when we come into this earth as an infant, and it's the most developed for the longest amount of time across the span of humans. So as humans, we're more wired to survive, not thrive. We're more wired to protect ourselves. So when we're with downstairs brain people, our brain perceives it as a threat. Our brain perceives it as a threat. So it's very natural for us to get triggered. It's very natural for us to go downstairs, to become dysregulated. That's why, like, the first part of responding to dysregulation, I say, is the C part, like check in with yourself. How are you? It's one of the reasons why I have a really hard time with a lot of behavior plans. I guess I should say response plans to dysregulation, that the adults don't often get the chance to debrief afterwards and really think about what happened for them. That's a metacognitive part of responding to dysregulation. And I think it's really important that the adults have a chance to identify what happened for them. So just this chart, what it is picture the infant who needs the adult to really complete all of their regulation. They have only the ability to, breathe, the basic survival, the breathing, peeing, pooping, and then crying for hunger. The adult has to meet all their needs, and gradually the responsibility shifts over. Now, this graph looks different for every human. I believe that some of our kids need this prolonged level of teaching and coaching for longer before they're ready for more gradual independence. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what happens sometimes is we expect this gradual graph for everybody, and then we wind up here, the child still needs that same level of support, and then everyone gets frustrated with why they're not more independent. And it's just a matter of benefiting from prolonged co-regulation, that teaching, coaching, and modeling, and that responsive co-regulation. Last thing, I'll skip through these. This is just my big quandrum with when a student's experiencing like reading difficulties. We make plans to support and teach the skills, but when there's behavior, we just basically tell the adults what to do, and the kid doesn't really have a say in much. But the gradual release of responsibility is really important. When we're teaching executive function skills, this gradual release is really important. This, I'm going to show you first and you watch, all the way to transitioning down to you show me, I watch, is really important to gradually transition that. Student helps me co-regulate. Yeah. Noticing when partnership is paramount, interdependence, and it's not about power differences. Yeah. That's huge. That's huge. So just last thing, what are problems? We have a goal, there's a problem, we have to make a new plan. All problems is when our original goal doesn't go the way we thought it would. So couple key things, supporting kids, supporting us to be really clear on what is the source of the problem. So I always say, like, okay, what can I do here? And then I think self-talk, if you want more resources on self-talk, I've been trying to really weave in a lot more self-talk work with kids. But what can I do here? What can I do? But with EF differences, this is where I want to end tonight. Think noir. When we think differences, when we notice something is happening for us, for our children, noticing is the first step. What's happening? And then objectifying that experience. So, okay, so I notice they're interrupting more. They're kind of jumping into conversations more. Identify what could be happening for them and identify if they're aware of it, and then review and reflect on what strategies could be used. If it's important for I use for the family example, but for school, I always say review and reflect on what could be used as a strategy, and then implement it, and then keep the loop going. Notice if it's working, objectify if it's working. The key here is objectifying. The key here is objectifying, always objectifying instead of subjective, like lazy, defiant, willful, malicious, coming back and objectifying what we observe, especially as it relates to executive function skills, because these are the ones that get labeled as all the terms. I know it's 4:57, so I just want to leave a minute in case there are any questions or anything that popped up for anybody. And if there's not, that's okay, but I always like to leave a couple minutes.
Danielle, this was amazing. We definitely need a part 2. Can you speak to how to talk with young kids or any kids about the executive functioning skill of like overcoming resistance? So downstairs brain's like, no, not doing the thing. But there's some things that you got to do. You may not need to do it that way, but how do you do that overcoming resistance thing when appropriate, and like teaching a kid to like think about like, you know, when am I really advocating for safety, or like when am I just, this is hard and I need to come up with another way of doing it?
It's a great question. I think the crucial part of that is, does the student know who their people are? So when we flip to downstairs brain, our first reflex is to find comfort and to see like, who do we feel safe with? So do they have people in their environment that they can go to? And if not, then that's like the first thing that has to happen. We have to feel safe with people, the people around us. And then the next step is starting to identify. There was an article, I think, I forget if I sent it to you, Mel, but it's like starting to like check your perception of how hard something's going to be before and after it. Like, how hard do you think this is going to be? And then after, how hard was it? And just doing that around like really like familiar things, so that it starts off, so that we develop this ability to kind of rate like, oh, I thought it was going to be really hard and it wasn't, or like, I didn't think it was going to be hard and it was, you know, just so you start to develop that ability to kind of gauge difficulty and ability to move something. So those two, I think, are great things. But the first is like, we are wired to find comfort in those around us. So do they have people they can go to kind of support them first?
Thank you. And by the way, if people have questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat box too.
I'll also put my email in the chat too. People have questions they want to email afterwards.
Awesome. Danielle, what advice would you give to families who are starting to observe, maybe wondering about some executive functioning differences in school and at home and all the things? What advice would you give to families about how to get started taking a closer look?
Yeah, so I think the first step is talking to this team at school. Like just know, I always think it helps to get a pulse from what the school knows about executive functions, and just saying like, oh, I wonder, how do you think this is showing up for them at school? And then just starting some brain dialogue at home, starting some brain dialogue about how our brains work, you know, what are we really good at, and starting from a really strengths-based approach, but just starting to weave in and model, right, that gradual release of responsibility, like, oh, I forgot to make that phone call today. I just didn't hold on to that. I bet I could try. So you're starting to model, like noticing, again, that objectifying, notify, that noir process, but just starting to coach it and, you know, label it, and then gradually transitioning it to support your child at home. But school, try and get a pulse on how familiar they are with these skills. I wonder if there's something about the reticular activating system and inhibition for doing the things. I think I haven't seen anything in the research, but I think there's just a lot of interesting overlap for me about the downstairs brain triggers and how much that can impact our ability to get upstairs to do all the things. And the more like just looking at the chemical networking of things, I don't have a good answer, but I'm really curious about it, Hannah. I'm really curious about it. But I think the downstairs brain, the threat, safety, perception, trauma, that all for me is just resonating so much lately as it pertains to how we problem solve and how we develop executive function skills.
Because it's actually an executive functioning skill to manage your dysregulation.
Yes.
So not only are you, so it's like the metacognitive aspects of noticing you're dysregulated, but then to problem solve what to do. And when you're dysregulated, you can't actively access like your cortex.
Yeah.
So that's where, so Hannah's making a point about sensory integration, because the idea is that, you know, sensory strategies, both proactive and responsive to dysregulation, is like an essential piece of this pie.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, and for that reason, when people are dysregulated, it does not help to ask them to use executive functioning to like make choices and reason and all the things, because it doesn't work.
That's why I have a problem with a lot of the emotional regulation programs that are used in schools, because they're cognitive based. And so they're like upstairs brain based. There's nothing about safety, perception of safety in response to dysregulation. It's like, what zone are you in? And that doesn't really help any brains. I'm like, if I were being really frustrated and somebody asked me what zone I'm in, I'd be like, bleh.
Also, and we talked about this last week at Brain Club when Casey Ehrlich was here, about neuroception, threat detection. And so when downstairs brain detects threat, whether that be a cognitive threat, a physical threat, I mean, any threat, you don't get to pick what's threatening, downstairs brain's just doing it. Violation of autonomy, the telling you what to do thing. If you do that when someone's dysregulated, I mean, that is never going to end well. And so a lot of the behavioral modification strategies, you know, the training, the behavior training, the compliance-based methods are really making dysregulation worse.
Yeah. Yeah. People got to understand the brain.
Yes. I love your brain. Thank you so much for sharing your brain with us today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was so glad to be here. I don't think I missed any questions. So awesome.
Awesome. And I'll send out recordings later today, and we'll be back next Sunday with our second month of Brain Club. And we're going to, the theme is co-regulation through the lifespan, various issues of, you know, early parenting transitions and family dynamics, and even working our way all through to actually capping off with the sandwich generation, specific challenges of both caring for children and caring for parents. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everybody.